But we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can be respectful of y'all's time, and Kevin's especially, because we know he is a busy man. But this is the final of our Matthew 25 sessions, but this is just the beginning of our Matthew 25 journey. And so I think most all of you have heard my spiel about Matthew 25, talking about how we're to mercy for the least of these. And so through the PCUSA's initiative called the Matthew 25 Initiative, three components of it are to eradicate systemic poverty, dismantle structural racism, and build congregational vitality. And so we've been exploring that for the last 5 weeks, and have plans on, are thinking of plans on how to continue with this journey, movement, whatever you want to call it. And so we've had great presentations from Equal Exchange last week, which is one of our partners in a more global sense, with Compassion Coalition that works to relieve systemic poverty in our community. Jack Neely spoke on history and especially history of the African American community in our town. And I'm forgetting one, aren't I? Was that? Anyways. Yeah, so it is good to be with y'all. Thank you for being with us and for spending this time. I'm going to turn it over to Miss Kelly, who is going to introduce Kevin, and they have known each other for quite a while. And it sounds like Kevin knows all the Norells, which sounds pretty cool. So that's pretty awesome. Kelly, take it away.
Okay. So Kevin is director of Lonsdale Area Ministries for Emerald Youth Foundation. He is a Christian community development professional who directs Emerald Youth Foundation's community development initiatives. He had a 20-year career in urban planning and community development before he came to Emerald Youth in 2009. He worked in Knoxville and Macon, among other places. He worked for 4 mayors in appointed positions, leading large teams in redevelopment projects. At Emerald Youth, he works closely with Knoxville's most challenged neighborhoods. He works with churches, nonprofits, and community groups, and he's a 2004 graduate of Leadership Knoxville. Now, I'm going to tell you how I know Kevin. I met Kevin in April of 2010 when I was doing an article on Emerald Youth Foundation and the Reverend Jim Bales, who was then pastor of Emerald Avenue United Methodist Church, for the Duke Divinity School online magazine. Jim is a graduate, is an alumnus of Duke Divinity School, and they think very highly of him and of Emerald Youth Foundation. I had lived in Knoxville for about 10 years at that time, but I had no understanding of how Knoxville ticked and fit together, which was a problem in writing this article. So everyone at Emerald Youth Foundation pointed me to Kevin as the one who understood those things. Kevin and I spent an afternoon together, and he drove me around urban Knoxville into about 5 neighborhood ministries of Emerald Youth. And for me, it was a life-changing experience. It was the first time Knoxville really felt like home. So when we at First Presbyterian started talking about who is my neighbor, the first person I thought of was Kevin. So I'm privileged to introduce you to him and to hear what he has to say today.
Thank you, Kelly. I have not figured out the posture you're supposed to have when someone's reading your bio. Like, or like more like, so I just don't know how to react to that, but I'm grateful for Kelly's friendship and grateful for your church and your pastor for her leadership in Knoxville has really made a difference. So I'm just pleased and privileged for this time. So is it okay? I'm not going to talk from prepared notes. I mean, I got a few notes, got stickies and things like that. But I'm just going to share my heart with you. Is that okay?
Certainly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Kelly and we were trying to figure out the sign for the presentation. I was going to give her a signal like, hey, you know, it's time. But we felt that you might think we were weird, or at least I was weird, you know, Kelly. So I'm not going to do that. So Kelly, if you will start the slideshow. Uh, Kelly gave me a challenge. She said, "Hey, why don't you talk about, you know, Knoxville, the last, you know, 100 years of the city, and why we have arrived at this point." And I said, okay, okay. And there's a lot of information that I have. You know, as Kelly mentioned, I'm a city planner by training. That's what my master's degree is in. I worked for the Metropolitan Planning Commission and worked in the city's development department for years. And always admired Steve Diggs, and he brought me onto one of his boards, and brought me back to town after I got really tired of politics. And so for the last 12 years, I have been working for Emerald and working with Steve, and just enjoying the opportunity we have. My passion is really this here is Knoxville. It's understanding the story of Knoxville, understanding the the issues, and so I'm calling our time just, you know, leaning on Holy Spirit, the isolation and disconnection of urban Knoxville. We believe that the root cause of some of our problems as a community lie in this idea of isolation and disconnection. So with that said, let me show you this video to sort of start our conversation.
Leon Dobson was a sophomore at Fulton High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. He played football, beloved by his classmates and his teachers. He headed to a friend's house to play video games. He wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hadn't made a bad decision. He was exactly where any other kid would be. Your kid, my kids. And then gunmen started firing. Hadn't even gotten started in life. Dove on top of 3 girls to shield them from the bullets. And he was shot in the head. And the girls were spared. He gave his life to save theirs. An act of heroism a lot bigger than anything we should ever expect from a 15-year-old. Greater love hath no man than this, that man lay down his life for his friends.
You know, I saw that speech from the former president and just was amazed that our troubles in our city had reached the Oval Office. And here we are having the chief elected official of the country talking about an incident that occurred within 1,000 feet of where I'm sitting and talking to you right now. It was a challenging moment for me. It was a one of those points in history where, prayed and thought and cried and said, what, Lord, where do we go from here? And then next slide, Kelly. This is here we are. We're here with the more recent shootings here within the last 3 months. Janaria Muhammad, who was a part of our volleyball program, and she also played other sports and danced. And Justin Taylor and Stanley Freeman and Jamarion Gillette all have lost their lives to gun violence, senseless killings. The lives were ahead of them. And so when Kelly challenged me with this idea of just walking you through what has happened, it is with this motivation that I try to tell the story of Knoxville. Now I'm going to tell you the story, both as what I've learned from a Christian community development standpoint, but also as an urban planner, as someone who has studied Knoxville and study housing policy. So with the next slide, Kelly, we will jump right in. I think the person besides Steve Diggs who may have influenced me the most is this professor, Bob Lupton. I don't know if you've heard of Bob, but Bob is very famous for writing a book called Toxic Charity. That book is very influential in nonprofit circles and churches. But he wrote a small, little thin book. This was his first book called Return Flight. And if you catch that title, you will probably guess correctly that it has something to do with the economic flight that happened in decades past. Some might even call it white flight. And he calls in that book, he calls for the church to return to the city. He calls for the Christians to return to the city. And that didn't mean all of us or everyone move to the city, because we know what happens when a large influx of people with means into a neighborhood. It can have positive and negative effects. But he was saying, return with our gifts, with our talents, our time, our energy, our investments. Steve, our first few years in ministry, used to give everyone he talked to for the first time this book, just to invest in them. It's now out of print, but we still really refer to it and use it. And he talks about the core issue is that with the changes in American cities, it's left a group of people in the city that are really disconnected. And I feel like we have in our great city, within a mile of the economic vitality of downtown, some areas, some sections that are so isolated, you won't believe that you're in Knoxville. And there's a place where I take folks on a tour. I do a tour for groups, for Johnson University, for many other groups, for people who want to orient themselves to Knoxville and some of our issues. I take them to Virginia Avenue and stand in a place where several public housing units were torn down. And I give them just a challenge of, tell me, what do they see? What do you see? And they mention how far they feel from the city. And I mentioned to them, you realize you're only a mile and a half away. But that is a brief description of the philosophy that sort of drives me and those who call ourselves Christian community developers. So let's start with Knoxville. Next slide. Our beautiful city, and I think it's important to understand who we are. And there are other eras, but I'm really gonna dive into four. This first one is the industrial age, or what is called the City Beautiful movement. The second that I'm going to dive into is the New Deal and its impact on Knoxville. The third is sort of the post-war, what we call in the profession cities in crisis era. And then finally, we're going to wrap up, something more recent, and it's new urbanism, the return to urbanism. And so we're going to go through all four of those movements. But let's start here. Our city was really shaped around industry. And, after slavery and ends in 1865, there's this industrial movement. And, just some of the things that happened there was a company started by John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, that prospered and later on was declared a monopoly. Also in that same year, freedmen had new access to politics. We actually elected our first United States African-American senator in 1870. And, many before Reconstruction really took shape, African Americans were experiencing a lot of business and political um, um, success. Also, moving throughout that decade, there was a lot of building going on. And, as a city planner, our profession was really launched by this moment in time in 1893 when there was the Chicago World Columbian Exposition. And Daniel Burnham introduced this idea of a white city. And when I say white city, that doesn't mean Caucasian, it means white buildings. It was this idea of these grand um, governmental structures. And, that was one event of many that led to the City Beautiful movement. Because with the industrial success was a lot of wealth. And you saw it played out in various instances. I'm a proud graduate of Knoxville College. Knoxville College was started in 1875. And I always tell people, because they forget this fact or did not know, but Knoxville College was a Christian expression of white abolitionists who declared that there needed to be normal schools to catch, freedmen up to the standard. And much of the wealth that was generated during this time, some of it was invested in these historically Black colleges. Rockefeller was so impressed by Spelman College that he ended up investing millions upon millions of dollars in that school. He started with a $250 gift, but once he learned more about it, really became deeply involved. One key figure in our city that I love to talk about is Cal Johnson. Cal Johnson was a notable figure, businessman, owned saloons, and owned a racetrack. He built a building in downtown Knoxville that still stands today, that was recently renovated and converted into lofts. He was elected to city alderman position in 1883. And our largest employer at the time was growing to be this Knoxville Iron Works. Knoxville Iron is key to the inner city development, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. Much of their physical plant was located in what we now call the World's Fair Park. Some of it was, the area that I-40 now covers. But the mechanics that worked for Knoxville Iron, settled in the neighborhood that we now call Mechanicsville. And Knoxville Iron did something interesting, is they recruited a lot of African Americans as well as whites to work at their facility. During that time, a lot of your skilled labor, particular with iron and things like that, were your freedmen. They had grown up, taking care of horses and dealing with horseshoes and things like that. And also they were pretty cheap labor. And so you have an indigenous African American community in Mechanicsville. Later on, Knoxville Iron will also expand to a second plant that still exists today. And I can look out my window and see it. It's a block away from me, in Lonsdale. And so the town of Lonsdale was created when, two guys, Lonist and Dale, decided to build this community around this burgeoning development. So Knoxville Iron was key, both in Mechanicsville and Lonsdale, and just the growth of this area. And then by the end of that first decade, we were doing like Chicago. And Knoxville was hosting its own expositions and successful Appalachian expositions. This building that I'm showing here, and I wish it still remained today, was a demonstration. It was built by Knoxville College students. So just this time of period of, still great poverty, but there was great wealth in our community. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of our community that remains here in the city was built during that time. And we think about the city, we think about East Knoxville as being poor and downtrodden, but that's really not the case. Knoxville, East Knoxville was very affluent, very affluent. The places where the streetcar ran, there was a streetcar line that ran to Chihuahua Park. And along there, if you notice, if you go a couple of streets off of Magnolia and just look at the size of the houses, okay, that were developed around this time, that was the high class folks. Park City was nothing to sneeze at, and Park Ridge had the large collection of houses built by a famed Knoxville architect, who's it'll come to me in a minute.
George Barber.
Yeah, Barber Homes all over. So, East Knoxville was a place that was very desirable. But not only that, you think about Mechanicsville had both its indigenous African American community and the working class parts of it, but it also had its large, what I call boss housing, and you looking around at Old North and others. So what remains intact today was either very affluent at that time or just very working class. All right, keep that in mind as we move forward. And then, Kelly challenged me with the 100-year history. And if you go directly back 100 years, you almost are in the same place, because we had a pandemic after the war in 1918. And it's interesting, the University of Tennessee did not play football in 1918 and 1919, And then by 1919, next slide, there were a lot of trying times in our cities. They nicknamed 1919 as the Red Summers of 1919. And let me just set the stage of what's happening in our great city in 1919. Again, the growth of our city is happening. Mountain View community, which you probably heard Jack Neely talk about in urban renewal, was annexed into our city in 1917. Lonsdale was annexed into our city in 1919. And Lincoln Park, so those were actually annexations. Another key thing that I love to talk about is what you see now on Gay Street, particularly the 100 block of Gay Street and somewhat in the 400 block of Gay Street. What you see today is their third floor. So the original Gay Street is deep underground, 2 floors underground. So in that year it was raised and the viaduct was open. And at the same time, you had an event that I think is little known in our city. Probably, I mean, you are an intimidating group, so you know this story. I'm betting about what happened at the corner of Central and Vine in our city. We had a flat out race war. And the story is that a mob developed on Market Square and ventured out to seek and to find this African American who apparently was allegedly involved in the killing of a white woman without much proof, and tried to get to him, tried to break into the jail to get to him. And eventually it led to a mob descending onto an all African American neighborhood down what was in that Bowery district. Bowery district is the old city and moving eastward. And the nickname for that area was called the Bottom. The Bottom. Anybody heard that term, the Bottom? And so, like I said, there was lots of African American homes, and this is one of the reasons why the baseball stadium is kind of a sticky issue, because right there is ground central of what was known as the Bottom. And so what happened was there was a group coming and a group that was ready for them. So after World War I, there were many African Americans who came home. They had been trained in war, and they decided, hey, I fought for this country. I'm not going to sit here and let myself be taken advantage of. So they met them. And for days, the story is that there was the exchange of gunfire, to the point where it says the National Guard was brought in and the machine gun was set up at the corner of Central and Vine. So that was sort of a turning point in that period. I'm not going to deal too much with the 20s, the roaring 20s and what happened there. But I think another key time that I think is interesting for us to understand is what I'm calling the New Deal. So you can go to the next slide. What I'm calling the New Deal in Knoxville. So we had the market crash of 1929. And FDR was elected, and just prior to his election, and then greatly during his time, was a lot of federal money coming to this area. And so some of the things that happened is the very Public Works Emergency Housing Corp was established. And that was the very first organization to start building some um, public housing. And the nation's very first public housing development was opened in Atlanta called Techwood Housing. Now, Techwood Housing is going to come up in our presentation, and those of you who are seasoned like me will know some of the events. And someone like me who studied housing, Techwood being the very first public housing is very a very interesting study. It's a landmark. And then there was the very well, the most notable, first of most notable housing acts, the Housing Acts of 1937. And what it did was it took what we learned, or what they learned in 1935, and with the development of the Public Works Emergency Housing Group, and formalized it to establish public housing. And there was lots of funding in that to create these large scale complexes. And also Fannie Mae was created directly after that. So what was happening here locally? Well, in 33, that's when TVA and North Dam was established. In 36, KCDC was, given this broad authority to acquire land and to build public housing. Broad authority that included eminent domain and other tools. And then by 38, you had the very first public housing in Knoxville developed, Western Heights and College Homes and Austin Homes. So they all kind of opened up. At the time, that $1 million building permit was the biggest building permit in our city's history. And so what was resulted in that development was 320 units of homes at College Homes, and another 244 at Western Heights, and 200 units of Austin Homes. More would be added to the Austin Homes as well as Western Heights. And then in 1940, the first public housing residents move in. Next slide. One thing I think it's important to note is that we think today, and I'm just going to talk about the stereotype as if it is like many people think that it is. Now, that's generalizing, and I understand that there's folks who don't feel that way, but public housing largely is viewed as only for minorities. That's where poor Black folks lived, and that it's a place where folks who don't work or are infirmed. It didn't start off that way. It was workforce housing. It was meant to house those who were working and needed a home. This picture here is very interesting. This is move-in day in 1940 of a family moving into Austin Homes. Here's another interesting fact. By charter, Western Heights was an all-white housing, public housing. It was segregated. College Homes was African American, but it was in its charter going to be all white. Little known fact. Next slide. The next era that I'd like to really go into picks up from that point. Boys go off to war, come back home in 45. Just prior to that, there is a GI Bill passed. And in that GI Bill is lots and lots and lots of money available to GIs for the purchase of a home. And I think it was almost 3 million people, 2.5 million people did just that through low cost loans and other incentives. And I entitled this the post-war, but cities in crisis, because this is really the point of crisis setting into our cities. Okay. Then there's the Housing Act of 1949. And what it did was it promised a decent and suitable home for every single American. And in this act, it more deeply funded public housing. So after that, you got Lonsdale Homes here locally, you got Walter, Taylor Homes and other um, developments starting to be funded. Montgomery Village came later. So that movement of really making public housing the answer to the decay in the city. And then there's the famous Act of 1954, which created the Urban Renewal Program. And I know Jack Neely talked to you all about that, and I could spend 50 minutes talking to you all about that as well, but I won't bore you with that. But I am going to try to give you um, the reason, the fear, the attitude, the disposition of our city that resulted not only in the what happened from an urban renewal standpoint, but again, this is all also being incentivized from Washington. Okay, Washington's pushing this money, and 2 years later, there was the Federal Highway Act of 1956. Again, FDR's trying to get people to work and he's building highways all over this country. But what happened is that the federal transportation money was coupled with the urban renewal. And so you had the public housing organizations and the TDOTs working together, and they were wiping out neighborhoods. And so you have in our town the Mountain View project, along with you know the construction of James White Parkway and others. So in a lot of cities, you see African Americans, particularly those neighborhoods closest to downtown, the ones that had proximity to, the financial capital of that region. Those were either wiped out through urban renewal or through a highway. Okay, and again, sort of a a an event that stopped that era was, the assassination of both John Kennedy and King. But let me go over quickly just some of the things that was the motivation here in Knoxville. Knoxville, we can have a chip on our shoulder. And in 1946, John Gunther writes an article in it, and he calls Knoxville the ugliest city in America. Okay, that hurt. The civil rights movement was starting to take hold. My family, just prior to the Clinton 12, my family, three of my aunts and one of my uncles were part of the Oak Ridge 85. And so they integrated Oak Ridge High School in 1955. And then a year later, you had the famous event in East Tennessee of the Clinton High School, situation there. The move west was happening, reaction to the school desegregation, a reaction to, the civil rights movement, a reaction to a lot of home building, but a lot of loans and resources to, get out of the city. In 1957 is when Western Plaza, was developed, and it was one of the very first shopping centers of its kind. Then in 1960, Dr. Martin Luther King came here to town, to Knoxville, and spoke at McMillan Chapel. And young man named Bob Booker, who some of us know was in attendance that day. And you had the sit-ins here. And then by the end of by 1964, you're deep into urban renewal, and urban renewal is really shaping that area just east of the city. Next slide. I said I wouldn't talk about urban renewal, but I'm going to talk about its successor. The failure of the urban renewal, and actually much of the federal housing policy over the last 100 years, much of it was problematic. Much of it had unintended impacts. Urban renewal happened to be the worst. But after that, and after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was the Housing Act of 1970, and there were lots of things happening out of after 1970, including the Fair Housing Act that made it illegal to discriminate. And then there was the Model Cities Demonstration Act of 1970. And here locally, we use that money to create what was called turnkey housing. Okay, turnkey housing. So what they did was they built these little mid-century homes all over Morningside. So Morningside was the neighborhood that abutted Mountain View community, the community devastated by urban renewal. So, the city leaders are going to make it right and replace a lot of that housing through these model cities. And, just as a planner, I actually like the little mid-century look of, a lot of these turnkey housing. But they put them right next to traditional houses that it just didn't match. And so if you drive around Morningside, you'll see this scene here. These houses are not next to each other, but it's just two photos I found in Morningside. And also it had a cultural aspect to the model cities program that it became known as, is that it tried to fund cultural activities. So there was an African American center called Turnkey that was built up there at the corner of Dandridge and McCalla at the time, up there on the hill, as well as parks, and they wanted to create more community buy-in. And so it required some comprehensive planning, required public participation. Lots of minority developers were hired during this time. So that was the reaction to the urban renewal. I figured Jack wouldn't tell you that. I'm proud to know a little fact that Jack may not know. So Jack, I don't, when he talks about urban renewal and anything he's researched, I just listen. But this piece, I think only a planner nerd like myself might understand. Next slide. And so you have this cities in crisis get elevated in the 70s and 80s. A first really notable landscape changing view of public housing came in Atlanta when the child murderers happened in the late 70s. And it was just a horrific time, a time where it puzzled local officials. Now, ground zero, the place where the most victims came from, and that was the Techwood housing. the Techwood Public Housing. That was the very first public housing complex. That was ground zero of that, where kids started missing from that. And so by then, leaders are asking themselves, HUD is asking themselves, what are we going to do about public housing? Next slide, Kelly. And then you started to, in the 80s, and I'm remembering this time very well because now I'm a teenager. Just lots of drugs and drug violence, the advent of cocaine, crack cocaine that could be made, take very expensive cocaine and combine it with baking soda, and you had a very cheap, deadly high. But not only that, just the the gang activity in the cities, the criminal activity of bringing the drugs into America, into our cities, left again us wondering, where do we go from an urban policy standpoint? All right, next slide. Now a little bit about my story. So I my dad pastored, and he went to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and pastored a while. We actually, he was going to accept a church. As Baptists, you're called to church, and you sort of go and you arrive as the called one. Sorry. And he was called to a church in Atlanta during the time of the child murders. And Dad was like, I'm not sure I should go there. I was 11. He was thinking about his boy, Kevin, and so we ended up moving to California. And so I grew up in California, and just great time to be in that. There became a new consciousness, around the time I was leaving for college. And for college, I wanted to come back to Knoxville, where my parents went to school, where they met. I wanted to attend a historically Black college like they did. Well, of course, they didn't have an option, but I did. And so I came back to Knoxville College, and excuse me. And so in 1988, I matriculated to KC, and a key moment for me happened in 1991. I was thinking about, next steps. I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. And this event happened in 1991. It was the Rodney King beating and the riots in LA. And that was very instrumental in me not choosing to go to divinity school, which was, great. Knowing how I'm wired now, was a great decision, and going to city planning school, and trying to figure out ways to address our city's problems. Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, and he had a very broad urban agenda, and it was fueled by the LA riots. At the time, Boys in the Hood was a movie that really moved the Clintons, and he talked about that. And so you had probably the most robust housing and urban policy of my lifetime, even more so than, President Obama later on, who was more focused on the economy and just other things that were happening, didn't have the luxury of really getting into those waters that President Clinton had to address. So he created a couple of programs that would deeply affect Knoxville. One is the Hope 6 program, and the Hope 6 program was designed to reform public housing. Okay, it was heavily influenced by a happening at the time, which was a return to urbanism. Okay, and so it was the opposite of, you know, the generation before, where you would, you really valued a house with a yard, with a driveway and a garage, your porches on the back of the house, with a fence. That was a, generational thing. Well, at the time in 1993, there was the Congress of New Urbanism that was calling for a return to more urban living, more density, front porches instead of back porches, uh, less space in between homes. And so that was taking shape, and that influenced this Hope Six um, grant that was given to cities. And so um, the very first recipient of this Hope Six monies was Atlanta, and the Olympics were coming, and they needed to replace this awful situation at Techwood, that we've talked about. And so Techwood was torn down, and Centennial Place was the very first um, um, new urbanist Hope Six federally funded project like that. That would later catch storm across the nation. By the end of the decade, you would turn on your TV, and you could see the attitudes about urban living just being reflected in the TV shows. Every show was in an apartment or a loft. So, whether it was Friends or Seinfeld or Frasier, I mean, downtown living became the thing. And so it shaped the way people thought, particularly young people. So I always said during this time, as I was a planner during the late 90s and early 2000, I would say that this generation is doing everything to get into the city that their parents escaped. Their parents did everything to get out of the city. They were trying to do everything to get in. And so, sort of some of the things happening here locally, we had, our landscape violent incident happened in 1996 when a little girl was shot and killed, here in Lonsdale, just literally feet from where Xavion was killed. Randy Boyd was by here a couple hours ago, and I took him to that spot where she was shot, and just said, "Here, this is where Brittany Daniels," and that was sort of a moment in our city's history of just trying to figure out what we were going to do with our public housing. Okay, in 1998, we received our first um, Hope Six grant. It was $26 million, and KCDC almost, and after it was all said and done, invested, I believe, 45 million, and they replaced all 320 units of housing at College Homes. And of course, College Homes is located right off of Western, and then it's bounded by College and University. And was very familiar with that because it was right next door to college, Knoxville College, where I went to school. And so, I would sometimes walk through that housing development, and that corner of University and College. You think at the intersection of college and university, there would be a lot of scholastic activity. There would be some excellence going on. But at that time in the early 90s, when I would walk through with my friends and such, it was drug dealer after drug dealer sort of lined up on that street. And so, College Homes was a likely choice for this program. And so What replaced the 320 units were 120 units of single family homes and duplexes. A third of them were still public housing and today are still public housing. But you can't look at it and say, oh, that's a public housing unit. So the traditional homes in the neighborhood were mimicked. You see there that 2001 Mechanicsville Commons opens. That's a house that was built to look like others in the neighborhood. In 2002, we moved into this neighborhood. This is where my son Jonah was born. He was born about 3 houses down from where this photo was taken. And I was working for the city and point person for downtown, and had the opportunity to convince our city leaders that downtown was a destination to live. And at the time we had 2 million, this is not an exaggeration, 2 million square feet of vacant space above storefronts. And so when we started talking up what's good for the city and what's happening in other cities in terms of loft development, we have this stock of great buildings that we can bring vitality. It was initially met with some pushback, by folks who didn't understand. They were saying, why would anybody live on Gay Street? I mean, come on, why would you do that? And so, a few years later, that 100 block was the first one to catch fire. And, you had Turnkey and Emporium come online, and then the Commerce Loft, and then the 400 block with Phoenix and others. And so that was all during my time of the city. So now you see in this the return of the city, this rebirth of downtown living. Next slide. How am I doing on time, Kelly?
We need to wrap it up pretty soon.
Okay.
Well, and if folks need to go, Kevin, you can keep going, a little bit longer, but if y'all need to go, feel free to, but stick around if you'd like for Kevin to finish.
Well, I got about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to focus on, Kelly, part of her challenge was to have me say where we're going from here. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave you with some opening questions that you can help me struggle with. The first one is, what is the role of the church in this changing landscape? What is our role? What do we as believers do? How do we help how do we become not only a Matthew 25 congregation, but a Matthew 25 community of believers? How do we do that? Second is what is the responsibility for caring and housing the poor? I think what has happened now is as folks have returned to the city, that poor families are moving further and further out. And that changing landscape is reflected by an affordable housing situation. And then the final thing is what do we do about urban education? Even some of the students we work with, we were challenged a few years ago when we realized that only 1% of our urban high school students, 1%, were achieving a 27 or 28 on their ACT. And why is that number important? Well, that's the average of an incoming freshman. So those are some of the challenging questions. I was disobedient to Kelly. I didn't tell you where he was going because I don't feel like I know. But I wanted to share with you some of the things that we're struggling with. And I'll leave you with this video, which is about 2 minutes. and then we can answer any questions you have.
One church in one neighborhood with a small group of kids. That was the beginning. It was an awakened commitment by a small congregation to reach city youth and their families, but a commitment that was daunting. The rapid decline and distress of the neighborhood resulted in many children in crisis. The situation was widespread across the city, and the broader community would be needed to respond. That realization led to the birth of Emerald Youth Foundation, which has served the children, teens, and young adults of urban Knoxville for 25 years. We exist to create ways for God's people to answer the call to the crisis and redefine what's possible for the nearly 12,000 economically disadvantaged young people in the heart of our city. Our aim is ambitious: to end the isolation and disconnection of Knoxville's young people, to draw them into healthy, supportive community, and to raise up the next generation of leaders. This means neighborhoods like Lonsdale, Oakwood, Lincoln Park, Mechanicsville, Vestal, and Burlington will be places where children can safely play in the streets and where the next generation will know Jesus Christ. It means flourishing communities where children will not be killing children and where young people will be healthier in mind, body, and soul. We envision Knoxville becoming a city where every child in every neighborhood has the opportunity for a full life.
With more than 2,000 young people served each year, our goal is to ensure a greater number of them are achieving youth development outcomes in faith, learning, and health. We ask ourselves challenging questions. Are Knoxville's children engaged in a neighborhood church and serving others? Are they academically ready for the next stage of education? And are our young people maintaining a healthy body? Our focus with Knoxville's youth is not on prevention and intervention, it's on preparation for a thriving adulthood.
Each year, almost 800 youth are engaged in our faith programs. Nearly 80% of kids in learning activities are showing improvement in math and reading. And we have 145 teams in sports like soccer, volleyball, basketball, and swim. In all these areas, long-term relationships matter, and they drive our results. Now is the time to scale success. At Emerald Youth Foundation, we have a 2020 vision for our city's young people. We will grow the number of youth achieving developmental milestones and annually produce a critical mass of promising, godly, young adult leaders for Knoxville. We will invest in our people, the staff, and volunteers who help implement the work. And we will become financially strong and sustainable. We invite you to help us solve our city's most profound youth challenges, and in doing so, transform Knoxville's urban neighborhoods and thousands of young lives at this defining moment.
Thank you all for your time and your energy and your tolerance of me for the last hour.
Kevin, we are so pleased to have you. Let's give a round of applause for our friend Kevin and for his passion and dedication for our city, for community development, for kids, for the church, for justice. I mean, his heart is just all over Knoxville, and we are grateful for your dedication. And so Jonathan Haskell wrote to me, he said he's not going to say it, but that was his project. So Jonathan, are you talking about that video?
I think he's talking about Market Square. And I think Jonathan misunderstands what point person means. It doesn't mean I can take credit for the redevelopment of Market Square. What it
I'm talking
meant
about
was,
Mechanicsville.
Mechanicsville, yeah, what, it,
All
what
right. All right. Well, there is that.
all that means is that I was around to deal with the irate public when all of this stuff was bad. So that's all it means.
Bless you for that. Yeah, goodness. Well, and we're pleased to have Jonathan, and I think I saw Glenn Spidell and a couple other visitors, and we're grateful to have them join us tonight too. There's Jonathan. Hey, Jonathan. You guys may have seen him. He's part of Justice Knox too. Anyways, I want to ask one question because I'm the one speaking, and I want. I'm really excited and thrilled and all kinds of adjectives about this resolution that Vice Mayor Gwen McKenzie passed. I think it was in December, and I can't remember, it's a long name, the African American racial equity restoration resolution. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And for those that don't know, the city approved this resolution unanimously to put $100 million into revitalizing, rebuilding, restoring the Black community, especially after urban renewal. And Kevin, if I'm saying that incorrectly, please let me know. But I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, and if you have any thoughts on how churches can be a part of that.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, and we have to get the semantics right, because the semantics are dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear reparations, that divides the room quickly.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what the resolution is. It's not really seeking to use public money in the coffers. It's to seek, incentives and grants to, further, reverse some of the things that happen. So, from that standpoint, I'm very supportive of it. I also understand the need. So if you think about Mountain View community alone, again, I mentioned it was annexed into the city at 1917, and the same time Lincoln Park and Lonsdale were annexed. So those three cities were annexed at the same time. Well, the housing in Mountain View wasn't much worse. In fact, I would argue is much better housing stock. And it was overwhelmingly home ownership. And many of those residents left their homes and went to public housing, which was a strategy. Again, I'm not convinced that people were doing it to cause harm. I just thought that was the solution of the day. But what happened is there's an enormous loss of wealth. Now, if you think about that real estate there, where our police station, the city coliseum, all of that, if that were still in families' hands right now, what would those homes be valued at? Just the economic scenario of having real estate in the center of our city. Also, think about the cultural impact. There was more than a dozen churches relocated. I mean, churches in our city that are very impactful and historic. Mount Zion, Mount Olive, where their churches were purchased, torn down, and relocated. East Knoxville was totally changed. You know, the people who moved here, you know, they don't understand that, you know, East Knoxville was not an African American community, but it was through that time where it transitioned, and you know, the fear, the disinvestment, the loss of wealth, all of that, I think, resulted into some of the problems that we would see play out. So yes, it's very much needed, and I'm grateful for the vice mayor for her work, her heart, and just the idea. I do think that how we communicate that to larger Knoxville in a manner that is not threatening, or, you know, like I said, you hear the words reparations on a headline, you know, it's going to turn a lot of readers off. So getting getting the semantics right is it's key to all of that working, in my opinion.
Right. And so the word reparation is not in it. It's restoration, right?
No, but when you have new newspapers, right, you can call it whatever you want.
Sure.
When the newspaper writes a story on it, that, you know, you don't have any control over that.
Yeah. So again, like he said, and I failed to say it, this $100 million over 10 years is not coming out of the city's budget. It's strictly going to be raised through grants and funding, and they've even said they're looking to churches to see how they can be a part of that. And so I'm really intrigued by that. Anyways, Jonathan, just looking at his name. Kevin, we are so grateful to have you. If y'all have any further questions and want to stick around, if Kevin is up for it, then by all means, stick around. But let me close with prayer, and we'll go from there. Good and gracious God, we are so thankful for the heart of your servant, Kevin, and the ministry and work that he is called to in our community. We are grateful for Emerald Youth and those ministries that work to empower and educate and seek restoration in our city. And so we pray for your guidance, for your spirit to lead us as we figure out how we can be a part of that much needed work. Oh God, be with us as we figure out how to live in community, as we seek to dismantle racism, build congregational vitalities in all churches, and dismantle structural racism. Oh God, hear our prayers, be with each of us until we meet again. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, friends, if you'd like to stick around for just a minute, because I know Kevin might be hungry or tired or something, but otherwise, go home and leave Zoom. All right.
Very gracious.
Kevin, do you have a short list of things you would love to see happen? I mean, you know, we're looking at breaking up an elephant. You know, it's such a big thing, and our church is looking for a direction, you know, a place to start.
Yeah, I think and churches can be very significant. You know, I talked a little bit, I'm not sure how many people were on, you know, this idea of supporting micro churches and caring for these passions that people have to do the work in different ways. I mean, it could be a coffee shop. It could be like I mentioned earlier, what Jonathan and Lori are doing with Vine. Those are ways that don't require church building. They don't require a big budget. You know, they can even be businesses as a way. And so we have to think as a church, you know, that, you know, it's not all about bringing them into the building and you know, inculcating them, and you know, but there's ways to impact, you know, the poor, the disconnected, and the aspects, you know, I talked a little bit about the food disparity earlier, something that Jonathan and Chris and I have talked a lot about, and I think churches can really instantly do something about this. There is a big problem in our city with payday lenders.
Mhm.
And so let me give you an example of what happened. So you can go to a payday lender, and he will give you $425. But in 2 weeks and at your next paycheck, you have to bring him $500.
Mm.
So he's making $75 a pop. So what happens is a lot of times folks can't live without that $500.
Mhm.
So the payday lender is very quick. Hey, no problem. Let me issue another $425. So, every 2 weeks, you're walking into the place with $500 and you're leaving with $425. You're doing that over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And over time, it's astronomical interest for not a very big amount of money. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, there was a lady in this town, and I'm not sure who helped her, but it was Christian people. She had 4 of these loans. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So she had $2,000 due every 2 weeks,
Mhm.
and she was losing $300 every 2 weeks. Is it my math right on that? 4 times 75 is 300. Yeah, $600 a month of lost income. She's walking into these places with 2 grand and walking out with $1,400. Okay. And she's getting nowhere on her principal.
Mhm.
All right. Getting nowhere. And so what this Christian group did was they loaned her $2,000 at 0 interest and said, pay us in the same timing as you're paying your payday lender. She paid the money off in less than 3 months because she's not dealing with that $600 interest. Okay. So with the agreement that, hey, look, you could never do this again. But without that help, that lady would have never got out of that trap. So that's a simple way where many of our churches could come up with a pot of money to relieve and to re-educate. um, I always say that um, community development, I use the fish story. Meredith, if we've all said that if I come to you and ask you for a meal, you feed me, I know you would feed me because you're a good lady, and but I would come back and say, hey, Meredith, what you gave me was really good. And you would look at me and say, you know what? I can't feed Kevin every day. He's too big. Okay. It's going to eat me out of house and home. So I'm going to teach him how to fish. All right. And so that's development. Okay. And then Meredith, as a good pastor that she is, she says, you know what? I got to figure out a program, a way to, buy a pond so that folks like Kevin aren't fishing out all the fish, and so that moves from individual development to community development. So I think churches have to think along those ways of not just doing charity, not just feeding for a day, because you know what, the next day, that situation still exists, but developing, that's our first line of defense. It's biblical. That I love the story of the man at the beautiful gate, and the first thing that Peter and John did was they looked at him and they saw him, and they asked him, hey, look at me. And so you have the miracle of him being healed and him walking, but the bigger miracle in my mind as a planner and community developer is from that point on, he had a community. He was one of Jesus's boys, just like they were. So they literally brought him along. And then the next scene, you see him inside the temple, and it says that he was standing there, telling about the goodness of the Lord along with the other disciples. So I think that should be the way we should approach the poor. It has to be more development.
Yeah, while we were talking, there's a lot of chatter about developing that, developing micro banks that would, downtown churches could do together. Jonathan just said we can advocate with our city and state representatives to regulate lending. All those are really exciting things.
Yes. And I do think that it's, our role as the people of God to figure out a way to help our neighbors get from I always say this, not, if I'm wearing you out with this information, I can end with it. But if you want to stay and talk another 30 minutes, I'm good too. But I don't feel it's our responsibility as Christians to solve everybody's problems. But I do think it is our responsibility to share in their suffering. We share in each other's suffering. So that doesn't always mean that I'm going to empty my bank account and give you everything I have. But I'm with my brain and with my gifts, I'm going to be present with you. I'm going to try to figure out a way to to get you to A and B. And I just think that's the posture we have to have.
Well, it's a different thing. And I mean, these things that we're talking about, I mean, they're beginning points, but they make sense. But we might not think of them on our own. So community is a valuable thing. I mean, just your coming tonight has, sort of set fires in a lot of us.
Well,
Hey, Kevin, I have a question. First of all, your presentation was wonderful, your graphics and your slides, and I'm a communication person and I love what you put together. So thank you so much.
Well, I had a lot of help from Kelly. There was like 16 misspellings before F o'clock. So we were getting that figured out. Thank you though.
So I'm kind of trying to regroup our church's voice and how do we speak in the community? How do we reach our own members and how do we reach the community as a whole? What do you think? What suggestions can you give us? How does the church speak into urban policy? And what do they, we're the oldest church in Knoxville. How do we use our roots to speak, God's justice into these policies? I mean, how would you advocate us speaking, our voice? What does that need to sound like?
I think posture is important.
Yeah.
The word posture. And, just another biblical example is that when, right before Jesus, healed Lazarus, Mary and Martha basically said the same thing to him. If you would have been here, my brother wouldn't die. But Mary took a different posture. She was on her knees. She moved him to weeping. Said the same thing, but it was her posture that was different. And I think that's relevant when speaking and when dealing. We have to have the right posture, right? I mean, so how that's played out, and Jonathan and I are members of the Christian Community Development Association. And, there are several principles, but one that I really love is this idea of how you live. Okay. And there's an ancient proverb that basically, I'm going to not do it justice, Jonathan, you can help me on there, but it says basically go to the people, live where they live and learn what they learn and, let them teach. But at the end of the day, they will feel like they've done it themselves. And so I think we kind of skip that step a lot of times. And I've made this mistake personally. I've done some things that people didn't ask me to do. We started a Christmas store a few years back, and I can remember one pastor who you all probably know in this town called me on December 23rd and said, "Hey, Kevin, find me a family to bless." And I said, "I know of a family, just had a baby. It's a mother and her mother living in the house, teenage mom." And so we went out and shopped for this family, and we came in on Christmas Eve like Santa Claus. And, I had food and, a bunch of presents. They were wrapped beautifully by, us church folks. And we put them under the tree, got them everything we wanted, they wanted, stocked the refrigerator. And I felt so good on Christmas Eve. I felt like Santa Claus. And later on, there was some resentment by that mom. And it took me a while to process what was going on. But, I had no business doing that. That was her place. It's her place to provide for her family. And so I took all the good I stole the good feelings, the admiration, that was theft. And so now that I understand it a little bit better, it just makes me sorrowful that I did. She kind of never really looked at me the same way. And because I didn't think about what I was doing. And so now we have a Christmas store where we take a lot of items and we price them so moms can come in, dads too, and buy those really cheaply. And they do the wrapping. They give, nobody knows that we're involved. But that's just a simple way of, posture difference where, we can affirm the dignity. You can't give dignity, but you can affirm it. You can affirm it. And so I think we as Christians constantly are affirming the dignity, the image of God in our brothers and sisters. So it's a long answer. I hope that makes sense. But I think how it's more about how we say things than what we say. It's more about, investing in the time to understand the community and to truly reflect their needs.
That's so helpful.
Kevin, thank you so much. I could sit here and listen to you to talk for forever. So, but we are grateful for you and for your work. And Katie and I and Kelly and Colleen might have to pick your brain at some point.
Absolutely. That's what I would. And Jonathan's too, if he'd let us.
I know it. Anyways, folks, let's let Kevin go so that he can get some rest. So, friends, peace be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.